At the heart of FTX collapse was a striking concentration power. As FTX expanded at a breakneck speed, the company failed to grow governance, internal controls, and professional accountability that should have grown at the same time. It lacked reliable financial statements, allowed executives to redirect customer funds, failed in addressing over 100 of investments, lacked risk management personnel, and also lent over $1 billion to insiders.
These weaknesses may have been hidden while confidence in the company was high, but once trust began to erode, they became impossible to ignore. Employees, investors, and customers were all relying on a system where authority was not being matched by the level of skill, transparency, and accountability the moment demanded.
To help make sense of what happened at FTX from an organizational behavior perspective, we are joined by special guest Dr. Adam Stoller.
Hi everyone, this is Adam.
Adam, when you look at the collapse of FTX through an organizational behavior lens, what would you say are the two most important concepts for understanding what went wrong?
I'd say the two most important OB frameworks for understanding the collapse of FTX are first, power, influence, and ethics, and second, judgment and decision making. Those are the best lenses because at its core, FTX was a story about how power was organized inside the company, who was allowed to hold influence, and how those people made decisions once they had that influence. Starting with power, FTX had both formal power and informal power concentrated in a very small inner circle. Formal power matters because this group had authority over major decisions involving customer funds, investments, and the direction of the company. But informal power matters just as much because influence in organizations rarely comes from title alone. It also comes from trust, status, closeness, and the perception that certain people are unusually capable. That is where expert power and referent power becomes useful. Expert power comes from perceived expertise, while referent power comes from being admired, trusted, or closely associated with someone powerful. At FTX, high-level authority seems to have been accepted more on the basis of insider trust, closeness, and relationship-based confidence than demonstrated competence. This is a serious OB failure because organizations become dangerous when they treat familiarity and loyalty as substitutes for expertise. People were given the credibility and deference that should only follow real expertise, without the competence needed to justify that deference. That becomes clear when we look at influence. Power only matters organizationally when it is translated into real influence over others, and people typically respond through internalization, compliance, or resistance. Employees internalize a leader's decision by following it because they support its reasoning. In a case like FTX, many employees don't fully internalize leadership decisions as wise or legitimate, and rather comply. They follow decisions even if they doubt it because the inner circle holds both authority and social credibility that feels risky to challenge. This allows bad decisions to spread as it reduces voice and correction. Organizations need people to question flight risks and challenge assumptions too. If employees stay silent because the people in charge are high-status insiders, then the company loses one of its main protections against error. On the ethics side, a healthy organization does not simply assume that powerful people will behave well. It builds counterweights through firmware controls, independent oversights, grievance channels, and norms that make it possible to speak truth to power. At FTX, those counterweights appear to have been weak or absent. If senior executives could redirect customer funds, if insider loans could exceed $1 billion, and if the company lacked financial and risk management personnel, it reflects an organizational structural issue of failing to restrain power. We can further understand the collapse from the judgment and decision-making side as a failure of decision-making under uncertainty and bias. Overconfidence is a bias where decision makers overestimate success, underestimate risk, and believe that their judgment is more accurate than it really is. That fits what we know about FTX very well. A company handling other people's assets at the scale that should have been extremely cautious about controls, documentations, governance, and risk management. Instead, leadership seems to have behaved as though it could manage extraordinarily complexity without the safeguards that a mature financial organization requires. The most damaging leaders are often not the ones who know the least, but the ones who know too little and still believe they can safely improvise. Bounded rationality is also highly relevant in our discussion. People do not make perfect decisions because they do not have the ability or resource to process all available information and alternatives optimally. In a fast-moving crypto exchange dealing with customer funds, affiliated entities, investments, and market validity, those limits would have been enormous. FTX failed to recognize and build systems to reduce reliance on individual judgment. Narrow framing also helps explain what went wrong. Narrow framing happens when leaders focus too much on one perspective of a decision while ignoring other relevant factors. At FTX, relationship-based staffing itself can be understood this way. Leadership seems to have framed key roles around trust and counter-closeness while ignoring equally important criteria like technical competence, governance experience, and willingness to challenge authority. More broadly, the company had framed success too narrowly around rapid growth and innovation, while underweighting accounting controls, documentations, and risk management. Escalation of commitment adds one more layer. Once FTX had elevated a small inner circle and built the company around its authority, it would have been both psychologically and politically difficult to admit that the structure was flawed. Leaders often double down in these situations with the hope that one more effort could fix things, since reversing course would mean admitting that earlier decisions were mistaken. They may also have continued on that path because the people in charge have too much confidence in their original model and have too much invested in defending it. So when these two frameworks are put together, the collapse becomes much easier to understand. The power, influence, and ethics framework explain how power was distributed and why the wrong people were able to wield so much influence. The judgment and decision-making framework explains how those same people made decisions once they had that influence. The core failure of FTX was the organizational mismatch between power and skill, and between confidence and competence.
Thank you so much for that analysis, Adam. Now let's hear what new CEO of FTX, John Ray, has to offer next.
When FTX hired me after their bankruptcy, I gave the same report as what Adam just said. I gave a couple of suggestions on how the collapse could be mitigated, but unfortunately, it was a little too late. Based on my analysis, my first recommendation was that FTX and any other organization dealing with customer assets must separate relationship-based trust from role qualifications. Senior positions in finance, treasury, and accounting must not be handed based primarily on whether a person is personally trusted or socially central. They should require documented competence, required experience, and sound judgment. The drawback is reduced founder control, slower staffing, and more tensions in startups which value speed and trust. However, for companies managing other people's cash, these costs are protective. Rigorous staffing reduces the chance of mistaking someone who is charismatic to be competent. My second recommendation was that qualified experts have real structural power, not merely advisory titles. Independent leaders in finance, risk, and compliance should have veto authority or escalation rights over major decisions affecting customer assets. Hiring experts is not enough if the internal team can just ignore them. This converts experience into real organizational influence, which adds healthy friction to decision making, which is a good antidote for overconfidence and narrow framing. The drawback is slower execution and rise of internal concerns. In a firm like FTX, the lack of friction is not strength, but it's a weakness. My third recommendation was to build an anti-biased decision process. Good decision-making requires systems that reduce blind spots. FTX should have required written documentation for major decisions, pre-mortems, and structured review of assumptions versus outcomes. These tools help counter overflow and escalation of commitments by forcing leaders to confront evidence that challenges their instincts, and they reduce narrow framing by ensuring decisions are evaluated from multiple different angles. It also encourages internalization amongst employees. The drawbacks is bureaucratic drag. These processes can make an organization less agile, but in an exchange-like business, agility without decision is far more dangerous than bureaucracy. My last recommendation was to build stronger ethical counterweights to power. This includes anonymous reporting channels, anti-retaliation protections, independent audits, and firm restrictions on insider rules. This makes it harder for powerful insiders to convert trust into unchecked privilege and makes it easier for employees to speak up about problems before they become systemic. The drawbacks are increased internal conflicts and a sense of distrust. However, in firms managing customer funds, trust should be procedural and verified instead of based on who is close to whom.
From what Adam and John have laid out, we can conclude that FTX collapsed from being built around a small, inexperienced inner circle whose power depended too much on relationships, insider trust, and social credibility rather than genuine skill and disciplined governance.